The Burnt Lady. The town of Terry Creek was just like any small town 364 days out of the year. Children played jump rope and waited for wonderful music from the ice cream truck to hit their ears. Parents of unruly teenagers always looking like they needed a drink. There was even a handful of elderly men whose great delight of the day was to yell at children to get off their lawn. But March 10th brought with it a whole new town. All schools and businesses closed down. You wouldn't find a single person outside. Everyone stayed in their homes with their doors and windows locked. Blinds and curtains were tightly shut, and families stayed far from the windows. It had all started well over 100 years back. There was an old, crotchety woman named Catherine Davies. Catherine wasn't liked by the community, and the feeling was mutual. She had never liked people, and that only got worse with age. She would glare and spit hatred at anyone who came close to her little house, regardless of their age. Her hateful demeanor had made her a target for the ridicule and pranks of the younger community. It was always pretty harmless, but of course there will always be those that take a joke too far. Randall Crowley and his cousin Jack were in their late teens. Randall's father was the mayor of Terry Creek, and that seemed to give the boys a good complex. They were as bad as they could be, and one day they set their eyes on Catherine. The original prank was supposed to be leaving a flaming bag of dog poo on her porch. The boys were drunk and decided it would be a good idea to use some lighter fluid on the bag. Unfortunately, they used far too much, and as soon as the match was lit, the whole porch went up in flames. Randall, who had set the fire, was left with some second-degree burn on his arm, but otherwise the boys were okay. Catherine wasn't so lucky. The flames had spread quickly throughout the house, and Catherine had been caught ablaze. She managed to get out of the house alive, but was left with third-degree burn all over her body. The flesh of her face had been eaten away, disfiguring her horribly. She was rushed to the hospital where doctors were able to save her life, but nothing could be done about her horrific scars. The mirrors in her hospital room were covered for her time there, as the sight of her reflection left her in a state of anguish. Witnesses had seen the Crowley boys running from the fire, and the burn marks on Randall's arm was enough proof to show that they had started the fire. The truth didn't matter. Catherine was disliked, and Randall and Jack were the kin of the mayor. No charges were brought up against them. Instead of feeling shame from their actions, the boys felt untouchable. They even came up with a cruel song making fun of Catherine. Have you seen Davies? Skin all crispy and brown? She's the ugliest thing in the whole damn town. Don't look at her face unless you want to be sick, because she's been beaten by the ugly stick. She's more beast than person, anyone can see, missing her nose and with skin like the bark of a tree. If you see dreadful Davies, then pick up a stone, throw it at her until she runs back to her charred home. Our eyes don't deserve to have to look at her face, so don't be afraid to put her in her place. The song grew popular amongst the youth of the town, and poor Catherine had even been pelted with rocks a few times. The cruelty she experienced drove her insane. Everything came to a head that March 10th. The bodies of the Crowley boys were found at the Quarry, a popular drinking spot in the town. They have died with looks of horror on their faces. Both boys were missing their eyes. As if someone had simply plucked them from their skulls, the town could only think of one suspect, Catherine Davies. The town created a mob and marched up to the Davies place. Barely standing, the house was charred and the front door was wide open. A few men stormed in, only to be shocked at the sight that met them. There lay the body of Catherine Davies. She had slit her throat. Next to her body was a note. It read, "Those nasty boys aren't the only ones who can rhyme, so I make this oath in my dying time. On the anniversary of this day, through the town I shall make my way, and if anyone should look upon my face, where they stand shall be their eternal resting place. But I shall do one thing before anyone dies. In their last moments, I shall pluck out their eyes. So when I plague you every year, don't forget it was your hatred that created your fear. Catherine was buried in an unmarked grave. The townspeople tried to shake off the haunting words, but 1 year later showed that Catherine had every intention of keeping her promise. She walked through the streets in a flowing black dress. Everything was shrouded in black cloth except for her face. That day, 23 people fell dead in the street, all missing their eyes, and so it went on for over a century. Every year, there was at least one person foolish enough not to believe the tale. Their screams would reach the ears of the families huddled together inside of their homes. The fools' bodies would be found on the 11th, missing their eyes. For 364 days out of the year, Terry Creek was like any small town. But once a year, may God have mercy on the souls of everyone who lay their eyes upon the visage of Catherine Davies, the burnt lady.
The timer has now begun. Don't get me wrong. I'm questioning why I'm writing this, or even telling you about it. But the last couple days have just been too crazy. And if the next 2 days are to be our last, I might as well tell you what the hell happened. Just wanted to say hi. Was the subject of an email I received after work. I'd gotten home, fed the dog, and just opened my laptop when it came into my inbox. Hell, it's obviously spam. But who knows? So I clicked it. I saw nothing. Just a blank email where writing should have been. I closed it and thought nothing more. An hour passes. Another chime. Another email. I go check, but no email. But wait, what's this? That same email from before is still there, now marked unread. That's weird. I click it. Still just a blank email. Think little of it and close it. Now, it's around midnight, and I'm about to pass out on my couch after binging Netflix. Another chime. I check my phone. Email is bold. Now I'm starting to wonder. Before I can even open it, I hear some rustling outside. Figure it's the neighbor's cat. I open the email. Get the door. A heavy knock hits my door just as I'm reading it. More like a thud, really. I jump back, startled. Reach for the closest thing I can find, which is a butter knife. If I hadn't nearly shat my pants, I guess the image would have been funny. I stood there, waiting, hardly breathing. Minutes, then probably over an hour. Frozen in fright. No other sounds. Then, in the silence of the night, a chime. I creep towards my phone, and that fucking bold message is sitting there, just like it was before. I open it. You had your chance. Before I can process the words, a timer pops up on my screen. It's been ticking away steadily. Can't get it off of my screen. Then it comes up randomly. 2 days I've been waiting for another knock. Blew off work. Blew off everything. No knock yet. Don't get me wrong. It could be a prank. I have a couple shitty friends I could think of that may have tried something like this. But somehow, I'm not too optimistic. Well, it's been another day. The timer's been funny. The hours don't always line up. Last night, there was 70 or so left. Today, 86 and counting. I'll tell you, I've been trying to look into this on my own. But here's the point I'm getting at. I can't. I have a couple good ideas about what may be happening, but every time I try to search for anything, even remotely related to my hunches, I just get shut down by the timer. I can still get on Reddit, however. Hasn't helped me until now. You all know how primitive the search option is here. But I came up with something. You. Yes. Each of you can help me. I know Reddit sleuthing doesn't always pan out, but you're my last hope. I'm basically a prisoner in my own home right now. And if I can't get to the bottom of this when that timer hits 0, I don't want to know what will happen. I moved into this house about 7 years ago, relocated for work. I'm in environmental research, particularly methane, and I oversee a lot of prospecting projects in the Midwest. Well, I noticed a few sites, one of which was off a reservation near eastern Oklahoma. There were a lot of disputes, but ultimately, the land was federal, and we went ahead with the survey. But something happened that rattled me a bit, even then. I was out at a bar the night we got the go-ahead in this small local town. Very quiet. Kind of a dive, really. Called the Lakota. And I'd had a couple drinks when the bartender hands me a glass. Says it's on the house. I think, okay, well that's pretty nice. I have been tipping him, so maybe he's reciprocating. He calls it the Han. I ask him what the hell that means. Han, he says, it's a strong little local flavor for you. Not one to be rude. I drink it. Tastes like jet fuel. I've never had anything like it, before or after. It burned down my whole throat, and for hours afterwards, it felt like I had some gnarly acid reflux. I chalked it up to dinner and didn't think much of it. But since then, I've occasionally felt this strange sensation in my chest. It's almost like my chest has little feathers in it, tingling. When I cough, it sounds like I've got a whole pillow stuffed under my chest plate. I'd been to the doctor plenty of times for it. They don't see anything. It's also not there all the time. Maybe every couple weeks or so I'll get that strange tingly feeling, like a muffled kind of pressing inside of my chest. But I don't want to digress forever here. The point I'm trying to make is that I'm certain now that this drink has something to do with all of this, or at the very least is a huge clue. I've tried getting on Google and looking as much as I can, but so far, no luck. All I can tell you is that he called it Han, and he said that it wasn't something he made often. The bottle he got it from, too, he told me was very special. It was mid-shelf at the bar, and it was always under the Midori. I wish I remembered everything he said, but I do know for sure he was clear that somehow it had to be under the Midori, that it couldn't be anywhere else in his bar, or any bar that served it. Please help me. Tell me what you found. I need to find a way out of this. I can't type more right now, but I will. But understand that if I don't get help on this, I'm done for. I'm begging you. I didn't get an ounce of sleep last night. And believe me, I tried. I tossed and turned, and found myself staring intently at that damn timer. I know now that it doesn't seem to count with any normal rhythm or beat. As comments were coming in from you all, I first saw it happening. It sped up. Seconds started flashing by. Sometimes 10 or 15 minutes would pass in just a moment. Then a chime. And a message. Again. Only a subject line. They can't help you. I jumped up from my bed and ran into the living room. Why? I can't say. I just needed to be as far away from my laptop as possible. That's when, bleary-eyed and exhausted, I saw it. In front of my living room window. Inside my fucking house. There stood a shape that I still can't find the words to describe. It nearly reached my ceiling and was oblong and vaguely humanoid, but lacked definition in every sense of the word. I froze, and it hovered there. It hardly moved, but I felt it staring into me. And at that moment, my chest cramped up, and it felt like somebody had stuffed cotton down my throat, like some nightmarish Build-A-Bear. And I couldn't breathe. I felt my lungs expanding and contracting. But no matter how hard I tried to breathe, I didn't feel the slightest whiff of air go into my body. My sight started to blur, and the light around my periphery started to fade. I stumbled back onto the couch, never taking my eyes off the shape that hovered before me. And just as I was about to lose my sight completely, it erupted from out of itself into a giant black mass that covered the entire wall and sent a blast of air that peeled me onto my couch. And with that, a bellowing, deep, gnarled shout that sounded vaguely human and came at me, reverberating the house and flexing the windows out, as if a bomb had gone off in just that instant. It screamed before it vanished. That's the last thing I remembered. I just woke up on my couch not 10 minutes ago, and the sunlight has started to come in through my window. I know it wasn't a dream, but my chest feels totally fine. The shape, I wish I could describe it better. It was almost like an anti-shape, like a mass of light sucking. It felt like a void manifested in front of me and calling for my confrontation with existence itself. And Lakota, that bar I'd gone to, I'm sure it was one and the same. I've tried to find out what it means, and what it has to do with Han. And with that story the bartender tried to tell me. Han had to be below Midori. I remember how insistent he was. And I can't help but think that this must have had something to do with that damn prospecting trip I was on. I remember meeting several people there, but the mood was downright uncanny. I mean, as an environmental researcher, I was always kind of the nerdy guy in the room. My extent of dealing with the government was writing a long, horribly boring grant proposal to secure funding for this or that. Even in methane, the research I found my specialty in, the running joke was that I was the highest paid cow turd observer. And yet, when we embarked on this project, what was from my understanding to be just a routine prospecting trip, there was an awful lot of government at every juncture. Before even setting up the trip, I had someone from the EPA reach out to me. And not just some bureaucrat, a real legit agent. He was very guarded about what he needed, except to tell me that the lands in question are in dispute. Funny, I thought. In dispute is usually what they say when they take land that's not theirs. I expected to show up and see protesters. Maybe some Native Americans trying to shut us down. But when we got out there, it was barren. They told me it was adjacent to a reservation, but as far as I could see was empty land. And driving out, I realized why it had been fenced off, and nobody was trying to get in either. The natives had set up some little towns on the outskirts, but they didn't look too keen on entering it either. Just imagine the picture here. Me, an EPA agent, and two interns standing in what looks to be an endless expanse of the flattest land you've ever seen. They told me the ground was in danger of liquefying. That was at least the first iteration of their story. They were concerned that, with such a liquefaction, the methane could escape and spark. In which case, the barren, dry, dead plot of land would burn like a matchbox. So they wanted controlled drilling. They said it was routine. But on this plot, they've never run into problems. Problems, I thought. Well, I've heard that before. I can't tell you how many jobs I've worked where people have gotten methane poisoning, or machines or drilling operations have failed, and people needed to be rescued. That was no big deal. Comes with the job, and I was used to it. But it wasn't until later that I found out what he meant by problems was on a different order entirely. I didn't get the full story until much later. But I know now that at least 7 government agents were burned to death before the day I ever set foot on that land. So much for routine. They never did give me details, and what I know I went through great lengths to find out. But what I first chalked up to simple methane poisoning, I now see much differently. Many had written of a black mass that precluded their vision, of a tightness in the chest that lingered even when they went back to their hotels, and of a strange hallucination, a word they couldn't recognize. 5 men and 2 women, all erupting in magnificent conflagrations, all ostensibly spontaneously. And I believe now that I know what they saw. And I heard that word for myself. yet I'm still here. But my time is running out. When I last checked, the timer had dropped to about 30 hours and was counting down steadily again. Please, help me. Find anything you can hear about the bar. Look into the clues, the drinks, anything. I've tried, but all my efforts are useless here. I'm running out of time.
Pale Luna. Written by Mihai Honoridis. In the last decade and a half, it's become infinitely easier to obtain exactly what you're looking for. By way of a couple of keystrokes, the internet has made it all too simple to use a computer to change reality. An abundance of information is merely a search engine away, to the point where it's hard to imagine life as any different. Yet, a generation ago, when the words streaming and torrent were meaningless save for conversations about water, people met face to face to conduct software swap parties, trading games and applications on Sharpie labeled 5 1/4-inch floppies. Of course, most of the time, the meets were a way for frugal, community-minded individuals to trade popular games like King's Quest and Maniac Mansion amongst themselves. However, a few early programming talents designed their own computer games to share amongst their circle of acquaintances, who in turn would pass it on until, if fun and well-designed enough, an independently developed game had its place in the collection of aficionados across the country. Think of it as the 80s equivalent of a viral video. Pale Luna, on the other hand, was never circulated outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. All known copies have been long disposed of. All computers that have ever run the game, now detritus, buried under layers of filth and polystyrene. The fact is attributed to a number of rather abstruse design choices made by its programmer. Pale Luna was a text adventure in the vein of Zork and The Lurking Horror, at a time when said genre was swiftly going out of fashion. Upon booting the program, the player was presented with a screen almost completely blank, except for the text. You are in a dark room. Moonlight shines through the window. There is gold in the corner, along with a shovel and a rope. There is a door to the east. Command? So began the game that one writer for a long out-of-print fanzine decried as enigmatic, nonsensical, and completely unplayable, as the only commands that the game would accept were pick up gold, pick up shovel, pick up rope, open door, and go east. The player was soon presented with the following: reap your reward. Pale Luna smiles at you. You are in a forest. There are paths to the north, west, and east. Command? What quickly infuriated the few who've played the game was the confusing and buggy nature of the second screen onward. Only one of the directional decisions would be the correct one. For example, on this occasion, a command to go in a direction other than north would lead to the system freezing, requiring the operator to hard reboot the entire computer. Further, any subsequent screens seem to merely repeat the above text, with the difference being only the directions available. Worse still, the standard text adventure commands appeared to be useless. The only accepted non-movement related prompts were use gold, which caused the game to display the message, not here. Use shovel, which brought up not now. And use rope, which prompted the text, you've already used this. Most who played the game progressed a couple of screens into it before becoming fed up by having to constantly reboot and tossing the disc in disgust, writing off the experience as a shoddily programmed farce. However, there is one thing about the world of computers that remains true. No matter the era, some people who use them have way too much time on their hands. A young man by the name of Michael Nevins decided to see if there was more to Pale Luna than met the eye. 5 hours and 33 screens worth of trial and error and unplugged computer cords later, he finally managed to make the game display different text. The text in this new area read, "Pale Luna smiles wide. There are no paths. Pale Luna smiles wide. The ground is soft. Pale Luna smiles wide. Here. Command." It was another hour before Nevin stumbled upon the proper combinations of phrases to make the game progress any further. Dig hole, drop gold, then fill hole. This caused the screen to display, "Congratulations, 40.24248, minus 121.4434. Upon which the game ceased to accept commands, requiring the user to reboot one last time. After some deliberation, Nevins came to the conclusion that the numbers referred to lines of latitude and longitude. The coordinates led to a point in the sprawling forest that dominated the nearby Lassen's volcanic park. As he possessed much more free time than sense, Nevins vowed to see Pale Luna through to its ending. The next day, armed with a map, a compass, and a shovel, he navigated the park's trails, noting with amusement how each turn he made corresponded roughly to those that he took in game. Though he initially regretted bringing the cumbersome digging tool on a mere hunch, the path similarity all but confirmed his suspicions that the journey would end with him face to face with an eccentric's buried treasure. Out of breath, after a tricky struggle to the coordinates, he was pleasantly surprised by a literal stumble upon a patch of uneven dirt. Shoveling as excitedly as he was, it would be an understatement to say that he was taken aback when his heavy strokes unearthed the badly decomposing head of a blonde-haired little girl. Nevins promptly reported the situation to the authorities. The girl was identified as Karen Paulson, 11, reported as missing to the San Diego Police Department a year and a half prior. Efforts were made to track down the programmer of Pale Luna, but the nearly anonymous legal gray area in which the software swapping community operated inescapably led to many dead ends. Collectors have been known to offer upwards of 6 figures for an authentic copy of the game. The rest of Karen's body was never found.
The world we live in is full of things we don't understand. Being the curious humans that we are, we naturally try and seek these things out. Doing so has led us to remarkable discoveries and inventions that we could never even have imagined 100 years ago. We have defeated disease, built to the sky itself, and even created machines that could take us beyond the clouds and into the stars. If our ancestors could see us and what we've created, I'm sure many of them would see us as gods. Our innate curiosity and lust for knowledge has not always led us to greatness, however. True evil and darkness have also been uncovered in humanity's conquest of knowledge, and, in the end, I fear this evil will be our doom. I do not say this from the standpoint of a great philosopher who has sat and simply pondered things either. No. I say this because I've seen it, experienced it. I was a part of it. The event I am about to relate to you is true in its entirety, this I swear. Feel certain that this will fall on deaf ears, and many of you will believe this to be just another spooky story meant to give you cheap thrills, but I promise you that this is neither my intent nor my purpose. The purpose of this story is to simply warn you all of what lurks beyond the veil of what we can see and understand, to show you what awaits us in the darkness, even if I myself don't understand it. What I'm about to tell you has happened, and I feel certain it will happen again. In 1971, a not-so-well-known scientist began preparations for an extremely secretive project known simply as the Harbinger Experiment. I would like to keep the identity of the scientist a secret for personal reasons, so Throughout this recounting, I will refer to him as Zimmerman. Zimmerman's background is unclear, at best beyond 1971. All that is known about him before that time is that he had grown up somewhere in Maryland with a strange fascination of the occult and supernatural. This later made him an outcast among his fellow scientists, due to how scoffed upon the metaphysical was, and still is, at the time. Zimmerman's opinions concerning the otherworldly were not the sole cause for him being an outcast, though. It was his methods that made him widely unaccepted among his peers. Zimmerman was well known during his time for being ruthless and cold beyond measure. He never cared about the means. All that mattered to him was results, and if he predicted the results to be valuable enough, anything would be worth obtaining them. It was this insatiable and brutal lust for the truth that made him feared among those that knew of him, and the few that knew of him, and did not fear him, believed in him, and followed him and his work closely. The word harbinger itself, such a mysterious and intimidating taste to it. Maybe it's the way it rolls from our tongues, or maybe it's simply due to its association with the project, but the word has always seemed to carry a certain amount of doom with it, which would make sense. The word itself means to warn or forebode. I can't imagine Zimmerman's reason for giving the experiment this title, but in retrospect it fits perfectly. Zimmerman came to a select few, me being one of them. He told us he was working on something big, and that he needed people who could keep confidentiality and not spread idle gossip of his work. While he did not fully trust some of us, he did know that we were professionals, and that, for some reason or another, we were all in dire need of employment. I had worked at the local clinic as a doctor, but I was caught stealing medication and was promptly fired. This left a very dark mark on my resume, so work was hard to find. I was also a native to Alaska and lived near where the experiment would take place, so I guess you could say I was a convenient choice. As you can imagine, I jumped at the opportunity. It was hard not to when I saw the payout. 15 of us were hired in total. Some were colleagues of his that had been working with him for a while. Some were maintenance workers, and a few were hired as private security. I was the only medical professional to be hired. It is still a wonder to me how he even attained the funds necessary for the experiment, and I would not be wholly surprised if his financing was not entirely legal, but legal or not, I needed the money, and he was paying. Looking back, it's a decision I've come to regret. After Zimmerman obtained this money, he used it to buy a relatively large plot of land deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. And upon that piece of land, Zimmerman built a concrete structure not dissimilar to a bunker. The sole difference being that its goal was to keep any potential damage contained within the structure rather than keeping it out, as he put it. Most of the structure dug underneath the earth, which had the effect of making the underground complex seem so much smaller than it really was from the outside, as would be expected. There was only one way of leaving and entering the underground structure, and it was via a ladder that led from a small, unassuming concrete building on the surface, which I will now refer to as the entrance building for convenience, to the network below. After everyone had gone to bed at night, the hatch that contained the ladder would be sealed off with a very large and thick metal lid. Zimmerman was very strict about this. Located not too far away from the entrance building was a series of wooden cabins that would serve as the sleeping quarters for the staff Zimmerman had hired. Compared to the entrance building standing on the surface, the underground system was massive. At the center of the complex was the control room. This is where all the facilities, electronics, and such were linked to. This included security cameras, lights, and door controls. Consoles, monitors, and computers lined the walls of this large central chamber. This is also where the ladder in the entrance building connected to in the underground complex. Connected to the control room were 3 doors. One led to a smaller room that served as the infirmary, another door led to a break room, and the last door led to the hallways. The hallways are where the complex began to feel extremely eerie. They were for some reason laid out in an extremely confusing scheme that led in circles and to complete dead ends. These hallways made up a vast majority of the complex, and it would be very easy to get lost in the maze if you were unfamiliar with the complex. But if you knew where you were going, you would find yourself standing before one of 3 8-by-8-foot rooms before long. Each room had a camera hooked up to one of the corners of the room, and all 3 of these cameras were connected to a corresponding monitor in the control room. Cameras were also scattered throughout the hallways so that whoever was watching their corresponding monitor could see anywhere they wanted to when they wanted to. Thick metal doors stood at the entrance to each of the 3 rooms, and in order to open them, you would have to enter a 4-digit code into a panel located near the door. I remember when I first arrived at the complex how badly the hallways frightened me. I've always been claustrophobic, you see, and those hallways were so very narrow. The noise, or more accurately, the lack of noise, was also a tremendous source of fear for me in those bleak, narrow hallways. It was always so unnaturally silent, as if the entire world had stopped moving. It really made you feel like you were trapped down there. Thankfully, though, I only rarely ventured into those hallways, as I was the only medical professional in the facility, and I had virtually no reason to go into any of them. In the beginning, I found it so peculiar that Zimmerman would ask for a medical professional like me on a project like this, but by the time it was all over, I understood why. The official purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to test and observe the effects of extended isolation on the human mind. This is what was listed on reports being sent out, at least, but unbeknownst to all those who were not participating in the project, excluding the subjects, the true purpose was much darker. Like I said before, Zimmerman had always had an obsession with the occult and supernatural. He sought to prove himself to those who did not believe in him. He wanted physical proof that the supernatural was a real phenomenon, and he wanted to be the first one to attain said proof. The true purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to find proof of the metaphysical, a world we could not see. The thought of doing this was naturally a tad bit daunting and even scary, but it was Zimmerman's method of doing so that was truly terrifying. Zimmerman believed he would be able to open a portal between worlds momentarily, allowing 3 random entities to cross over to our world, and each one of these beings would be trapped within one of the 3 rooms. Zimmerman had the theory that any entity would try and latch onto the nearest living thing that had the capacity for it. He wanted to use this technique to trap a spirit in a physical form by allowing it to enter a living being that had been injected with compound mixtures of Zimmerman's creation. In theory, this compound would keep the entity from simply leaving whatever it was attached to. The only way it would be able to leave a host who had been injected with the compound was through death. According to Zimmerman, the host would have to be something living, with a will strong enough to survive the possession, and there's only one known species that possesses the amount of will required for this: humans. Zimmerman had also done something to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms, and that there would only be one in each room, though I can't say I know exactly what he did. In fact, I know next to nothing when it comes to how Zimmerman managed to do what he did. He liked to keep his methodology a secret to his most trusted colleagues, most likely due to his paranoia that someone would steal his ideas and take credit for the success of said ideas. If I had known that this was the true purpose before I signed up, I may have reconsidered, but Zimmerman decided to not tell us until we were all gathered at his fortress. Even if any of us wanted to leave, I doubt we would have been allowed to do so. The security team Zimmerman had hired was loyal to him and the payout. It is not likely that Zimmerman had given them the order to now allow anyone to leave. There were 3 different subjects included in the experiment. All were native to Alaska, and each one was lured into the project under the belief that they would be participating in a harmless study of the effect of isolation on the human mind, as I mentioned before, which is why none of the subjects objected when they realized that they would be confined to one of the 3 rooms I mentioned earlier. The first subject was a young man. He was apparently out of work and desperately needed the money that had been offered for participating in the study. The second was a woman, and by looking at her I could tell she was an addict of some sort. The third and final subject was an older man, a drifter if I had to guess. One thing that they all had in common was that none of them had any family or friends left. In short, no one would miss them, which is why they were chosen for the project. I am sorry, I wish I could supply more information about the subjects, but all this has been drawn from memory, and I was given little information on the 3 to begin with. The experiment did not officially begin until 1987, 16 years after its original announcement. I was eager to begin, so I packed up and headed out to the complex as soon as I could. I arrived at the compound a week before the subjects had even signed up, and a whole month before the project even began. I was not the first to arrive by any means. When I got there, Zimmerman, his colleagues, and the security team had already arrived. I suppose you could say I was among the people Zimmerman did not trust to arrive first. There was a noticeable rift between those who were there simply for the money, like me, and those who were followers of Zimmerman. On October 15th, 1987, all the preparations were in place. The subjects had been sealed in their rooms, the cameras, lights, and speakers were fully operational, and all the staff members had settled in. The time had come for the experiment to officially begin. Zimmerman asked everyone to report to the control room around 9 p.m. to witness the beginning of the experiment. He wanted everyone to be present when he proved that all his theories had been correct, that he was not just a madman. He wanted us all to see the fruits of his labor. When everyone had fully gathered in the large control room, Zimmerman turned to us and simply said, "Observe." He then turned his back to us, leaned into the microphone that would project his voice through the 3 rooms, and then he began chanting in a strange language that I feel certain no one but Zimmerman could understand. We all observed the 3 large monitors on the wall, silently waiting for something to happen. The subjects all stood in their room, dumbstruck by Zimmerman's chanting, staring at the monitors with confused expressions on their faces. After about 5 minutes, I felt something awful. I can't explain what exactly it was, but a horrible feeling of dread washed over me, riddling me with fear. It was then that the ground actually began to shake subtly and the lights began to flicker. Zimmerman continued chanting into the microphone as if nothing was off or wrong, while the subjects began dashing around their rooms, screaming for help. Then suddenly the ground stopped shaking, and the monitor's image turned to static. The air began to become very heavy as we all stared at the monitors, waiting for them to regain their image and show us what was happening, or had happened, in those 3 rooms. For a while all was silent, but then there was screaming. The screams of a woman going through unbearable pain and terror began to echo through the compound. The similar screams of men began to coincide with the woman's terrified screams, and together they mixed into an awful symphony of pain and fear that was beat mercilessly into our ears. Those of us who were here for the money began to give each other scared looks, while those loyal to Zimmerman seemed completely unfazed. We wanted to leave and never come back to this awful place, but we all knew, deep down, that Zimmerman would never allow that to happen. We were here for the long haul. There was no escape. It was 10:13 p.m. when the screaming finally stopped. The monitors had yet to reveal to us what had occurred in those 3 rooms. As soon as the screaming ended, Zimmerman stood and dismissed us all for the night, adding that we were all forbidden to come back into the compound until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, not like any of us wanted to. We all solemnly made our way out of the compound and towards the cabins, and settled in for the night. I feel it is safe to say that not all of us slept well that night, and I was not one of them. The following morning, all the staff had arrived at the entrance building. We all stood inside exchanging tired or nervous looks as we waited for Zimmerman to arrive and open the hatch that concealed the ladder. I could see palpable fear in the eyes of some of us, while others did not seem to have even been remotely affected by what happened last night. Zimmerman showed up 5 minutes after 10, apologizing for his tardiness as he came to the door of the entrance building. He opened the hatch and, without any hesitation, began descending the ladder downwards into the black abyss. He almost seemed enthusiastic. I was the first to follow behind Zimmerman's dark descent into the facility. It seemed that the further I climbed down, the more the darkness closed in on me, as if it was trying to swallow me whole. As I climbed deeper, I couldn't help but feel that this place was different somehow. While before there was only the unsettling concrete hallways and rooms, now there was something else. Something made the eeriness feel so real and personified. I felt like a horrible and gruesome scene awaited us down there, but I continued climbing downward despite my fear and my hesitation. This was no longer just a spooky bunker. There was darkness and malevolence in the air. A true evil now lived here, and I could feel it. We all could. I finally felt my foot touch ground and let out a silent sigh of relief to be on solid ground. Almost as if on cue, the light bulbs came alive, dousing the room in their warm and welcome light. Zimmerman must have turned on the power, I thought. I allowed myself to take a couple seconds to examine the control room. It was exactly as we had left it last night, for which I gave a silent and thankful prayer. It was almost as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I shook myself from my thoughts as I remembered the static-filled monitors from the night before. I let my eyes slowly make their way towards the monitors on the wall, anticipating the grim and fearful scenes that would be on them. My attention was first grabbed by Monitor 1 and 3, which were still pure static. It would have been a small relief, but then the motionless image on Monitor 2 caught my eye. Room 2 was entirely still, and everything seemed entirely untouched. I couldn't help but gasp as I noticed the only thing that was different: the woman. The woman lay in the center of the small concrete room. An expression of fear and terror was frozen into her gaunt face as she lay silent and lifeless on her back. Zimmerman's expression turned angry when he saw this. He ordered that the second monitor be turned off, and it was. We didn't ask why. It's not like any of us wanted to see the dreadful scene any longer. He also ordered that if the images in monitors 1 and 3 did not return within the next 2 hours, a security team would be sent to investigate the rooms. The security team nodded at hearing this. They made it seem as if they had no fear, but I could see it in their eyes. The subtly loud tick-tock of the clock was the only sound that echoed through the control room while I stared at the monitors. An hour and 50 minutes had gone by, and static was still all that occupied monitors 1 and 3. All the other staff members were working except me. This is due to the fact that the project had been completely injury-free thus far, so I essentially had nothing to do but wait for someone to hurt themselves. Zimmerman, a couple of his colleagues, and I were the only ones that occupied the room. They quietly chatted amongst each other on the other side of the room while I spent my time reading and pondering the situation I currently found myself in. I'd clearly made a mistake coming here. The corpse lying in room 2 was evidence enough of this, and God only knew what awaited us in rooms 1 and 3. My thoughts were soon interrupted as Monitor 3's image returned. The clear image now displayed on the screen made everyone's eyes noticeably widen. What was displayed on the monitor was horrifying. That humanoid thing stood in the center of the room, staring directly at the camera, unmoving. It was wearing the jumpsuit that Subject 3 had been issued, but this clearly was not the same man that had entered the room. What caught my attention first was its eyes. They were solid black, and twice the size of normal human eyes. They seemed so endless, cold. Its head had also grown with the eyes in such a symmetrical and unsettling manner. The being had also shed all the hair it once had, and even from the monitor, I could see how unnaturally smooth and clear its skin was. It had also seemingly grown in height and stature, which could be seen in the fact that the jumpsuit was now obviously far too small for its wearer. Its limbs had grown especially long. Its arms hung almost as low as the creature's knees. What we were looking at was in no way the same man we had sent inside. Fear. Fear was all I felt as I continued to stare into the monitor at the thing in the room. And my fear seemed to be shared by those around me, which made me feel kinda good. It may sound awful, but it was a bit satisfying to see that Zimmerman and his colleagues could feel fear too. But at the same time, it was worrying, because this showed that this was not part of Zimmerman's plan. Something had gone wrong. We all stared into the monitor at the thing despite our fear. It was almost as if we were in a trance. My already present fear began to grow and spread rapidly through my body as I became lost in the creature's eyes, trapped in its terrifyingly hypnotic gaze. After what felt like forever, I managed to break eye contact with the creature and divert my attention from the monitor, and when I did so, I felt my fear levels drop considerably. After a short while, Zimmerman ordered his security team to make their way to Subject 1's door, just as he said he would do. The security team left without question, armed only with batons and pistols. I focused my attention on watching the men progress through the hallways towards Subject 1's room via the cameras. even through the not-so-high-quality cameras, it wasn't hard to tell that these men were afraid of what awaited them. Their heads were downcast as they walked. They did not possess the same confidence within them that they did when this project began. They looked like scared boys being sent off to a terrible war. Eventually, they made it to the door. We had perfect vision of them, and the door via the hallway camera. The men already had their pistols out by the time the button was pushed. Slowly, the door began to open. We all watched eagerly as the men began to approach the door, guns aimed inside. Suddenly, and without warning, there was a loud shriek, and as something bounded out of the room at the men, the monitor turned into static. Immediately, we could hear screaming echoing down the hallways, followed shortly after by the distinct sound of gunshots. We could do nothing but wait. After a couple minutes, the screaming and gunshots stopped. We all waited and prayed, hoping that whatever bounded at them from the room would not be one to return to the control room. After a couple more minutes, 3 of the men came back, carrying with them the corpse of the 4th. He had massive cuts along his chest, and his face was shredded. You couldn't even tell who he was anymore, or even that he was human. I was used to gore, being a doctor and all, so I felt somewhat unfazed by the mass of shredded flesh and bloodied meat that they carried with them, but many of the others went pale and vomited. The security team all wore emotionless expressions and eyes filled with terror. One of the men finally looked up at us. He stared at us for a while with those wide eyes of his. It's dead," he finally managed to mutter in a shaken and scared voice. A couple hours went by. The dead man's name was Frank. He was buried outside in the cold Alaskan ground. 2 of the men were unharmed, physically at least. The 3rd was alive, but only barely. His body was covered in bloody slashes and one of his eyes had been gouged out. I managed to stabilize him, but only just. The other 2 men vaguely explained what happened. Apparently, Subject 1 leaped out at Frank after the door had opened, only it wasn't really Subject 1 anymore. According to them, it had a hideously contorted face and long, sharp claws. They claimed to have shot it over a dozen times before it fell dead, and then they emptied another dozen bullets into it just to be sure it was really dead. Only once it was dead did they come back. After tending to the wounded man, I went to investigate the monitors. As afraid as I was of seeing what those monitors may have held, I needed to see. Subject 3 was the only one left now, and I needed to see it and make sure the creature was still in his room. It seemed to be more like a jail cell than an ordinary room at this point, though, which was probably a good thing. The cameras displaying Subject 1's room and the hallway outside it still displayed a static-filled screen. No one was sent to repair them or investigate. We just had to hope that Subject 1 was well and truly dead. Monitor 3's image was exactly the same as I had left it. Subject 3 was still staring directly into the camera at us. He was still in the exact same position, and if it were not for the small fan in the corner of the room, I would think I was looking at a still image. In a way, I felt relief at seeing this. Relief that he was still in his room and had not escaped while no one was looking. After everything quieted down, I noticed something especially unusual. There was a strange sound emanating from somewhere. At first it was barely noticeable. The only reason I heard it was because of how extremely quiet it was in the infirmary, but as time went by, it slowly began to increase in volume. After about an hour, it was loud enough that everyone else could hear it too, and after a couple more hours its volume had increased so much that we could determine what the noise was. It was a song. One of the staff members identified it as Living in the Sunlight by Tiny Tim. Apparently, his father loved the song and listened to it frequently. The song seemed to be on a loop and kept replaying itself. Although we were able to identify the noise, we remained unable to identify its source. We knew that it wasn't coming from the speakers because we had turned them off. It seemed to be emitting from the walls themselves. More time ticked by as we all began to become increasingly agitated by the song. I spent most of my time in the infirmary attending to Frank or in the control room. Fear hung in the air, and the presence of unmistakable darkness and evil was no doubt its source. Subject 3 had still not moved. He had kept his unblinking gaze fixed on the camera the entire time. It always felt like he was staring directly at me, no matter where I was in the room. I think this effect was also felt by others due to the fact that they seemed to move around the room a lot, and for seemingly no reason. After a few hours, the song was so loud that people almost had to shout in order to communicate. We had been trying to find its source so that we could turn the song off, but it was to no avail. The source was completely unidentifiable. This added a level of extreme irritation to our already very present fear. It was around 8:30 that the ground itself began to shake once again, just as it had done the previous night. Panic began to spread among my fellow employees and me as the shaking grew in intensity. During this, I had the sudden instinctual feeling to look over at Subject 3's monitor. It was gone. Almost as if on cue, the power went out, and thankfully the song did as well. Ever since the security team came back, panic had been slowly building up among the staff, and Zimmerman was powerless to stop it. When those lights went out, the calm projections that everyone had been trying to maintain left us, and the fear in all our hearts took over. The emergency backup lights kicked on shortly after the power went out, which I gave a silent, thankful prayer for. The lights were dim, but they still allowed me to see a lot. Total panic seized us as many of my fellow staff members began screaming and rushing to the ladder in an attempt to escape. But too many were trying to use it at once, and no one was able to get very far on the ladder without someone else pulling them to the floor and taking their place. Zimmerman was shouting for everyone to calm down, but his dominating and intimidating personality had no effect here, and his demands fell upon deaf ears. It was total chaos. It wasn't long until people actually started hurting each other in their desperate attempts to get up that ladder and out of this place. I could only stand against the wall and wait for my opportunity to escape up the ladder. All the screams were soon silenced, as the familiar hum of that now unsettling song began to rise in volume again, only much quicker this time. And this time, it was clear that the noise was coming directly from the maze-like corridors. People stopped fighting and shouting, as all our attention shifted to the door that led to the hallways. The song quickly got louder than it had ever been before, which forced many of us to cup our ears with our hands in an attempt to silence the noise. Then, suddenly, the song just completely stopped. Silence. That was all that filled the room as we all stared at the thick metal door in anticipation for what was coming. It felt like ages had gone by, but in reality it was only probably seconds before the silence was broken. The door suddenly and violently burst open, and the music started again, louder than it had ever been before. The suddenness and the volume of this caused many of us to recoil by falling to the ground and grabbing our ears in an attempt to block out the noise. I glanced up for just a second, and in the doorway stood a tall, smooth-skinned figure, with long limbs and eyes so dark and malevolent that you could clearly see them in the dim lighting. After I got my bearings, I looked upwards at the creature once again just in time to see the thing pick up and rip Zimmerman in half, in one fluid movement, dousing the room and everyone in it with his blood, intestines, and organs. I was no stranger to gore, but the sight of that was too much for me to bear. I hunched over immediately after seeing this and vomited all over the cold cement floor. That ladder is my only hope of survival, I thought to myself as I forced myself to a standing position, and as my eyes rose along with the rest of me, I could see the thing ripping and tearing through the people as they scattered in an attempt to escape it. It was distracted, and as awful as it sounds, this was my only chance to get up that ladder. I forced my legs to move towards the ladder, trying to block out the terrified screams of my fellow staff members and the unbearably loud music. I could hear gunshots coinciding with the screams and horrible sounds of flesh being ripped apart somewhere in the mess of noise. I reached my hands outwards and felt a wave of relief wash over me as my fingers came into contact with the hard metal rungs of the ladder. I gripped them and began to climb upwards as quickly as I could in my disoriented state, all the while praying that the monster would not see me and pull me off the ladder and back into the slaughter. It felt like at any moment I would feel one of its smooth hands wrap around my ankles and pull me to my death, but I eventually did make it to the top. There was no question in my mind. I had to close the hatch and seal that thing down there, even if it meant certain death for my colleagues. I could not allow that thing to escape. I gripped the thick metal lid and began to push with all my might in an attempt to seal the underground complex off. Despite how dense and sturdy it was, the lid was surprisingly easy to move and did not take very much effort to push it over the hatch, even in my weakened state. In seconds, the hatch was completely covered by the dense metal lid. I collapsed on my side and began to vomit some more as exhaustion overtook me, and as I lay there, I realized something. Aside from my labored breaths, the only thing I could hear was the faint echo of that song from down below. I felt as though I would lose more of my sanity if I continued to lay there and listen to that song, so I once again forced myself to my feet and began to make my way to the wooden lodge I had stayed in the previous night. It was where I had left my baggage, and also where I had left the keys to my truck. Of the 15 staff members that took part in the Forsaken experiment, I'm the only one who survived. I've never returned to the awful place where all of this happened, and I don't intend to. The project was very secretive, and Zimmerman was the only one who knew all the details of it, and, so far as I know, no one is aware of my involvement aside from me. In fact, I'm probably the only one who knows what the Harbinger experiment truly was, let alone what actually happened. By now, you're probably wondering why I've told all of you about something none of you should be aware of. Maybe you're expecting me to give you a speech about not messing with things you don't understand, or something along those lines. I hope not, for I have no speech to give, or lesson to impart. I began hearing a noise earlier today. Almost immediately I recognized the noise as a very haunting and familiar song. I didn't even try to trace it to its source. I knew it would be pointless. And as the day has progressed, the song has increased in volume. It's loud enough now that I can very clearly make out the lyrics. I'm completely unable to escape Tiny Tim's voice. It's followed me everywhere I've gone. Subject 3 is coming for me, and I know my time left in this world is extremely limited now. I guess you could say that I just wanted to tell the tale of the Harbinger experiment before it was lost forever. I hope that you will take some lesson from what I have recounted to you, but I think we both know you won't. Let's be honest. You don't believe a word of what I've just told you, and I don't blame you. I wouldn't believe me if I were you. To you, this is nothing more than something to get your cheap thrills from. You were probably mindlessly surfing the internet when you clicked a link and found yourself here, wherever here may be, hearing this story. And, to be honest, I don't care if you believe me or not. Even if you do, it probably won't stop you from trying to uncover the truth of a darkness that few of us have ever seen. It certainly never stopped Zimmerman. If you want a lesson, look at what happened to him when he went seeking the truth. I pray that none of you will ever discover this truth. I pray that none of you ever have to see the evil that I've seen. I hope you all get to live in ignorance of what lies beyond the veil of what we can understand. It's here now. I can feel its black eyes burning into me just as I could all those years ago. I am as much to blame as Zimmerman is for the monstrosity that is now free to roam the world, even if I was not the one to create it. I'm sorry. Please, forgive me.
In May of 2012, I was undertaking a 5-hour drive from Glasgow to the northern tip of the Highlands for the Ullapool Book Festival. I was a doctoral research student and had received a small bursary to attend, but due to my teaching duties that week, I found myself driving up alone fairly late on a Thursday evening. It wasn't a terribly long drive, but having left the city after 8 p.m., I found myself tiring around the Cairngorms and decided it was the safest if I pulled over for a cat nap. At the time, I was driving my beloved old Mini and had a bit of an embarrassing affection for all things retro. I was therefore carrying a ridiculously old Nokia mobile phone with the battery life of a Spinal Tap drummer and absolutely no internet capability. I had pulled over into one of the parking areas of the national park at Aviemore, where I specifically chose one of the smaller car parks that acted as an access point for hill climbers. These areas permit overnight parking, are generally off the main road, and are unlit, which I thought would be best facilitate a quiet rest before I start driving again. What with it being Scotland, it was raining lightly and the air was chill. I lowered my seat and pulled my coat over me, drifting off fairly quickly as the rain drummed pleasantly on the roof of the car. I woke with a start sometime later. I was in darkness, slightly disorientated, and vaguely aware that I had heard a thump somewhere on the bodywork of the car. The combination of chill outside air and my warm breath inside had fogged the windows, and I couldn't see out. I was by no means panicking, sure that it was just been the metal chassis settling as the engine cooled, and I picked up my mobile to check the time. I was cursing slightly under my breath about the fact that my battery had died when I heard a distinct tap, tap, tap on the lower side of the passenger door. I was unnerved and I reached across the seat to check to see if the door was locked. Do you ever talk to yourself when you're nervous? I certainly do. And I was quietly chidling myself for being a baby when the tap, tap, taps sounded from the rear passenger panel. I immediately shut up and stared at the back window. No movement, no shadows. A bit exasperated with myself, I switched on the engine. Turning on the hot air to clear the windows, I would have preferred to sleep a bit longer, but my nerves had me wide awake and I decided I'd be, making tracks. It took an age for the windows to clear. Always did with my old Mini, thanks to the bus fan on the passenger side. And I sat for a couple of minutes before I began to see more clearly through the steam. My heart about plummeted to the floor when a brief movement in the wing mirror caught my eye. Something was lurking around the back of my car. I immediately switched on my headlamps, and the car park ahead of me was flooded with light. There were no other cars, which I found comforting, assured that it must therefore be an animal I had seen in the mirror. I was restoring my seat to its normal position when something clattered deafeningly against my window by my face. I screamed in pure instinct and immediately peeled out of the car park, a thick fog still obscuring the majority of my rear window. My heart stopped hammering about 10 miles down the road when I realized that no one was following me. By the time I reached my hotel, just over 2 hours later, I had decided I had most likely been hit by a bird or possibly a bat, and had laughed at my skittishness. I got out of the car and stretched my legs in the bright car park of the hotel, enjoying the cool air after being cooped up for so long in a confined space. When I went to collect my bag from the back seat, I noticed an envelope tucked underneath and opened it with curiosity. Dear driver, you should be more careful about where you park at night. I sat in the passenger seat for almost 10 minutes and wrote this while you slept. Your passenger window can be eased down by hand. Take care. I drove home from the festival early on Sunday afternoon, determined to make the journey in one daylight trip. I had my window checked at a garage back in Glasgow, and sure enough, the locking mechanism was broken. I'll never know if my visitor thought that they were being a good Samaritan or took some pleasure in frightening me, but either way, the thought of some stranger sitting on my passenger seat, watching me while I slept that night, still chills me to the bone.
My name is Heather and I'm currently 24 years old. This story happened back on July 4th, 2018. I know, almost 2 years ago already. It feels like it was just yesterday. Anyway, my parents were having a party at their house, inviting family, friends, and neighbors. Along with my boyfriend Chris, our friends Emily, Hal, and Monica went with us. Despite almost all of us there getting wasted, we all had a good time. It became nighttime around 9 o'clock. That's when the fireworks show started. Everyone at the party sat down in chairs or the ground as we watched the show. We were all talking and watching the fireworks, having a good time. Then, Hal suddenly turned his head behind us, looking out into the woods. Chris, Emily, Monica, and I all laughed and asked him what happened. He shushed us and then got up and walked towards the end of the backyard and listened more towards the woods. No one else noticed since the fireworks were still going off. Chris got up next to me and walked over, putting his red Solo cup half filled with beer down on the table. He also listened into the woods and jumped back in shock. Hal turned towards him and asked, "You hear it too?" Chris nodded his head. "What is it?" Monica asked. Chris responded, saying that there was some weird noise coming from the woods. Me and the other girls looked at each other and started laughing as we knew they were just joking with us. It's the most cliche thing that could ever happen, like in a movie. Of course it was fake. At least that's what I thought. Hal and Chris both looked confused and swore they weren't lying. I still didn't believe them, neither did Monica. Emily, however, suggested in a playful tone that we should go investigate. That was an obvious joke, but the boys thought she was being serious. Idiots. They took out their phones and turned the flashlight on. That's when they ventured into the woods. Emily followed them, just leaving me and Monica in the backyard. We decided to go as well and got our phones out. The stupid thing is that we didn't tell anybody where we were going. We also didn't grab anything to defend ourselves with if we had to. It was just 5 drunk 22-year-olds wandering into the woods at night. The music and lights from my parents' house got farther away, but the fireworks were still loud and booming. Chris, Hal, and Emily were now nowhere in sight. Me and Monica started to sober up now. Monica suggested we go back, but there was no way I was leaving my boyfriend and friends in the woods alone, especially at night. Then, from the darkness, we both heard a girl screaming. It had to be Emily. Monica and I glanced at each other before running towards where we heard the scream. We stopped running when we saw Emily follow the ground, not moving. In front of her was a person in all black with some sort of black mask on, holding a baseball bat. We also saw Chris and Hal on the ground, also unconscious. The person turned around and we could see it was a ski mask, painted all black. I mean, it was a man, it had to be. He then ran towards us, causing Monica and I to run back towards the house. We came back screaming like maniacs. The guy wasn't chasing us anymore, but that didn't matter. Monica and I were still scared out of our minds. Everyone in the backyard turned around and stood up. We told them some guy in the woods with a ski mask on is kidnapping Chris, Hal, and Emily. My dad ran inside of his house while my Uncle Rob ran to his pickup truck. Both of them came back with shotguns in their hands. Monica and I led them towards the area where we saw Chris, Hal, and Emily tied up and being dragged by the man. He didn't hear us, thank God. My dad screamed, "Hey!" The man turned around like a deer. He held his bat up and put it back down after seeing the guns. He dropped Chris, Hal, Emily, and the bat and then put his hands up. Monica called the police, but when she dialed 911, the man took off. My dad and Uncle Rob chased him, but to no avail. We got back to the house just in time for the cops to come. 4 officers showed up. 2 of them stayed with us at the house while the other 2 went into the woods to search for the man. The little kids that were there had no idea what was going on, so they stayed in the living room with my mom. We told the officers everything that happened. Chris, Hal, and Emily woke up at the same time the officers came back from the woods, saying they couldn't find the man. The rest of the night was a disaster. Another police car arrived, and by then the other neighbors that weren't invited came out to see what happened. It turned into a whole big scene that I and my friends would very much like to forget. Almost 2 years later, and the man still hasn't been caught. Chris, Hal, and Emily were the ones that were freaked out the most, understandably, of course. They said that when they got deeper into the woods, they could make out the noise to be a very loud, a very non-human sounding growl. That's when Chris and Hal were hit in the back of their heads by the man. Emily found them seconds later, and when she saw the man, she started to scream. The man covered her mouth and then hit her over the head. That's when Monica and I found them. I don't know what the man would have done with them if Monica and I didn't go looking for them. All I know is that man is seriously messed up and needs to be caught.
I have been debating if I wanted to post this story because it was really unnerving. However, with all this COVID-19 and quarantining, I figured that I might as well share the story in order to kill some time. For the past 2 years, I have been working at a haunted house attraction. It's a really fun gig, but the job tends to attract some rather creepy individuals. For the past 2 years that I have worked there has always been some kind of creep that also works there. I have another Let's Not Meet post that recounts the first year's scary incident, and it's still up if you want to check it out. This post in particular will recount my second year's creepy incident. I'll start the story with Orientation Day. This is where we meet all the other fellow actors and choose your roles. When I walked into the building, my heart fell to the pit of my stomach. A man who looked like the same creeper from my first year at the haunted house was waiting for orientation to start, but I knew that it couldn't possibly be the same man, because the man from my first year had actually killed himself months ago. And to make matters even stranger, this man even had the same name, Daniel. So I first thought this was all just a wild coincidence. There's no way this man will also turn out to be a creep. Boy, was I wrong. Allow me to describe Daniel. He was a man probably in his late 40s or early 50s. He was a short and pudgy man. From the beginning, everyone could kinda tell that he was a little socially awkward. And there's nothing wrong with that, but he really did kinda creep out most of the workers. Additionally, he couldn't drive, so he was either super early or super late, and he was usually the last to leave. So, overall, he was a peculiar fellow. But hey, we're all working at a peculiar job. Orientation came and went without any issues, and soon the attraction started. To understand the story, let me explain where I was located in the attraction. I was located in a large maze outside of the main house, with about 5 other guys, including Daniel. These 5 guys were scattered throughout the maze, and I was at the center of it, in a large rectangular room. This room was enclosed, unlike the rest of the maze, and had 2 exits. All of the guys besides Daniel were around my age, which was 18. Honestly, I don't even know whose brilliant idea was to put a lone girl in a large maze with 5 guys. Thankfully, I was somewhat friends with one of the guys, so I didn't feel too alone. However, this friend was located at the tail end of the maze. Daniel was located decently close to my room, but that didn't bother me at first. There was no reason for Daniel or any of the other guys to enter my room. They all had their own positions to handle. One other thing to understand about this maze is that all of the actors were still able to see one another because the walls in the maze were relatively short. So, despite being far away from my friend, I was still able to see him. Now, I hope that I explained that clearly. Nothing strange occurred the first 2 nights, but on the 3rd night, Daniel made his move. When no customers were going through the attraction, the actors would just walk around the maze or sit on the ground to relax. During these times, I would leave my room and either sit on the ground somewhere or enter the main house to grab a water bottle. In order to enter the maze house, I would have to go through the maze and pass Daniel's area. The first few times that I did this, Daniel said nothing and would just watch me. However, on the 3rd day, he finally mustered up the courage to say, "Hey, how are you?" Not thinking anything of it, I happily replied and carried on to fetch a water bottle. From then on, anytime I passed him, he always had some comment. It was harmless things at first, like, "You're really good, the weather's nice out here, you're a pretty scary actor." So other than him always having something to say, I really didn't think too much of it. Days continued on, and Daniel kept getting a little braver. In between breaks, he would awkwardly walk towards the center of the maze. He moved really slowly, like he was trying to be stealthy. My only saving grace was that before he could reach my room, a group of customers would begin to approach, and he would have to run back to his position. This is when alarm bells began to ring. I knew there was no reason for Daniel to leave his position and come to mine. Now, whenever I saw that he was motioning towards my room, I would go out the other direction, in hopes to put more distance between us. It didn't help that he was dressed in a scary costume and wearing a mask. This only added to the tension. On the times where I chose to sit on the ground and wait for customers, Daniel would go through the maze and stand where a single wall separated us. Looking back, I should have just walked away, but I didn't want to come off as a rude, punk-ass teenager. This is when he introduced himself, even though we already did that on orientation day. Trying to play nice, I introduced myself, and we shook hands. Then he said the words that I will never forget. "You're beautiful." This caught me so off guard that all I could say was, "I'm sorry." He then repeated himself and kept his gaze locked on me. I very awkwardly replied, "Thanks," and refused to make eye contact with him. Keep in mind, I'm an 18-year-old girl. and he is a man in his 40s, maybe 50s. I am also covered in sweat, mud, and fake blood. Thoroughly creeped out, I was now determined to avoid him at all costs. Whenever we had breaks, I now went through the maze in the opposite direction of Daniel in order to get to the main house. It was a longer route, but it was worth it. Daniel soon noticed this, and now put more of an effort in walking towards my room between breaks. There were several times where he actually entered the room, but thankfully I had the wits to leave the room entirely and go stand where my friend was. Daniel would just stand in my room, look around, and one time he sat down on the floor. It was actually comical sometimes to see him standing in my room, realize customers are coming, then rush out of there and back into this position. Sadly, with how dark the maze was, I couldn't always keep a sharp eye on Daniel's whereabouts. There was one incident where he approached me unexpectedly and said, "I like the way you scream." One of my lines that I said in the attraction to customers was, "You can't leave me, I need you." And Daniel just absolutely ate that up and loved it. Well, you can bet after he said that, he liked that line, I stopped using it. I had to endure a month of this, but over time, Daniel got the message that I was not interested. In retaliation, he began to steal my scare points. There were certain areas, called scare points, near my room that I would pop out of and scare customers. These scare points were accessible to other actors, but no one else used them but me. I suppose Daniel was mad that I wasn't giving him any attention, so he decided to steal my scare points as revenge. He also began to copy some of my lines. Thankfully, towards the end of the haunt season, the managers of the attraction moved me inside the main house. I'm not sure why though, because I didn't say anything to them about Daniel, even though I know I should have. So, for the final days working there, I was nowhere near Daniel. When the season ended, I was relieved. However, the managers had the bright idea to open up a Christmas-themed haunted house, and they asked me to work out there. I loved the job, and didn't plan on having a creep ruin it for me. Although many actors from the Halloween season didn't return for the Christmas attraction, Daniel was not one of them. He was there, and he was thrilled to see that I had returned as well. This time, however, I convinced my best friend to work there. So, with my best friend being there, she sort of acted as a deterrent for Daniel. Throughout the whole season, he never approached me. Well, that was until the final night. My friend and I were chilling in one of the rooms, and waited on customers. This room was the first room in the attraction, so everyone else was passing through in order to get to their positions. Daniel began to pass through, then suddenly turned back around to face my friend and me. Again, with those beady, never-blinking eyes, he said, "I think you two are beautiful." I just cringed and looked away, as my friend shyly replied, "Thank you." So, overall, Daniel is pretty creepy, but I suspect that maybe he doesn't know what he is doing is wrong. I don't think he really realizes that flirting with young girls and trying to be in a room alone with them is okay. I caught word that he might be autistic, but I don't know for sure. But the feeling of dread I had in that maze is a feeling I will never forget. In retrospect, I really should have told someone. I kept telling myself that if Daniel did one more thing or tried to enter my room again, that I would tell the managers. One thing that I can think of that at least lightens the mood is that his costume was literally Tree Man. His mask was just a tree with a contorted, scary face. When customers would walk by, they would all shout, "Look, it's Groot." It got a good laugh out of me every time. If I explain this story poorly, I'm sorry, and please ask anything if you're confused. So, Daniel, maybe you're just looking for love, but you're looking in the wrong places, man. I'm assuming I will see you again this coming season, and if I do, just please, stay away from me.